you're looking at, there we go, is the front of the engine. I just committed to buying a brand new timing belt and water pump kit with idler and pulley, and idler and tensioner. Got a good deal on it on Facebook Marketplace. So what I decided to do is I moved transmission, there it is, to the ground, and underneath I'm supporting the engine with a transmission jack on the oil pan. That's going to allow me to take that engine mount loose, slide the whole engine towards the driver's side, and free up a lot of space in front to do the timing belt change. So I'm picking that up tomorrow, which means I should be able to work on it tomorrow night because I have tomorrow night in the garage. So I'm going to do that now. Take the bolt out of the engine mount, move the engine, and then try to re-support it with that 2x or with a 4x4 just for safety's sake. Alright, here we go with the directions for timing belt. Negative bad, I've done a little bit more, so I'm going to do some following of directions here. I've got the engine mount out of the way. The engine now is slightly shifted that way. Frees up all this space, but as you can see it's pretty tight, so I'll bring you back once I get some of the items removed and explain to you what I've done. Alright, so the engine mount is out. Everything has been slid that way an inch and a half or so, which is nice to get to all that. I'm having difficulty getting the dipstick out, so I'm going to first of all remove this ground wire here. I just need to remember to put it back. It attaches to this front engine hoist hook, loop, eye, whatever. So that will, I don't have to frog around with that anymore. At this point it doesn't appear that I need to take off the tube for the dipstick. I need to just take out the dipstick, which I've done. I've also removed all of the screws here which attach the valve cover to the head, and that was done with a 10mm, shocking, socket. I saved you from the noise of my air wrench. So I've tapped it loose, and the unveiling of a double overhead cam valve train there. Looks pretty clean for an engine with 200 and so thousand miles on it. Exposes the timing belt here. So I'm going to leave this loose, but laying on top to protect, keep the dust out of there. Put the rags back on so I don't drop anything until I need to actually have it off permanently. I'll leave it on there. Back to the directions. What comes next? After they call it the cylinder head cover, I take off the timing belt cover, upper, middle, and lower. So that's on the other side. So I'm going to call it a night. I'm going to take a look at this other side. We'll look at it together, I guess. There's the... Okay, so that's the upper one there, and then there's this lower one, and then a middle one, and then a lower one. So I'm assuming these all will come freely. Just set this off to the side for now. I believe I've gotten all of the bolts out that hold this cover on, so it just pulls out there. Can join its friends on the shelf there. Okay, so it looks like this one, I don't see any other screws. I certainly don't want to break anything, so I'm gonna put you down, see if I find any more. I'll bring you back when those are off. Alright, so all of timing covers are off. Here are the key instructions on getting the timing belt sprockets. So that single pinhole is straight up, and then these two marks for intake and exhaust are right at those little arrows there. Have the 21mm socket on there. Slowly turn. Alright, so that would be what I would interpret as straight up and down on the engine, because the engine is kind of tilted. They're aligned at the top, but they're not, don't seem to be aligned here at the bottom. Alright, so looking down in here, I would say those marks are pretty close to where they need to be. At least the exhaust is. The intake appears to be slightly off. I guess the bottom line here, and I compare that now to the pin is supposed to be facing the arrow, and it is not. So we're going to take the timing belt off. We're going to attempt to reinstall it all with everything pointed to where it's supposed to be. Right, the tensioner and the idler, as well as an engine mount bracket, have both been removed. Tensioner, idler. So I'm left with this tensioner spring right here. I just wanted to make sure that I get it recorded, its orientation. So the hook on the right, the shorter of the two, goes to the engine, whereas the longer one goes to the tensioner. And then I've got the timing belt off. So the next thing to do is remove the bolts that hold the water pump in place, replace the water pump, and then go back with the idler and the tensioner, and then the belt. So I'll bring you back when I got the water pump off. Water pump is out. There's the hole where it used to reside. And see that tube coming in there from the side next to the screwdriver that's blocking off the dipstick? That is the cold water return. There is, coming from the direction opposite the screwdriver along the front, what I'll call the front side of the engine, is another coolant line. There's an O-ring between that housing, it's almost like a thermostat housing, and that tube that runs around to the other end of the engine. And so that came along with the kit. I need to remove that piece, that housing piece, from the tube so I can put the new O-ring on. So give you another look. That tube coming into the right goes into that housing with an O-ring. So, relatively clean return housing to go along with the very clean new water pump. And I also, you probably can't see down in there. Anyway, I also cleaned the pipe, the tube that wraps around the front and goes over there. So the next thing I'm going to do now is gather the gasket and remount the water pump over that gaping hole. Alright, the water pump is in place with the gasket, and I looked at the manual, I looked at the pattern of the gasket. It appears to be only one way it could fit. So that is the way it's on. There's a gasket that goes between this coolant return housing and the water pump, and it, as you can see here, is got a interesting opening, probably matches the water pump. So I'm just going to make sure the opening of the gasket matches the pattern on the face of this housing. And then I've got 2 bolts that will bolt that up, and I also have a new gasket, sorry, a new O-ring with some grease on it to give it some lubrication. Oh, that reminds me, grease. So the gasket, being we're talking vertical on the water pump, needed something to hold it in place. The gasket that was there before did not appear to have any sort of RTV or Permatex. So what I did is I just put 4 dabs of grease on the face, the ceiling face of the water pump to hold the gasket in place, and that'll just get squeezed out. So don't need to do that here, basically because I can get to the sides of it, and also because the screws will hold it in place. It was a little more challenging to have done that with the water pump. An arrowhead on the engine housing, engine block, is pointing at a divot in this pulley wheel, and that is in line. If that bolt was off, you'd see it was in line with the key. So that is the bottom end. Now on the top, by using these pry bars held in place by a zip tie there and by the weight of the longer tie bar there. Alright, so you can see the mark there has to line up pointing at the arrow on this plate, and the mark, well, there it is, the mark there has to point at that arrow. So we're going to call that really darn close. Now I'm going to take 2 hands after I put you down and attempt to thread the timing belt on around the tensioner there, which is being held out to release as much of the tension as possible, and then the idler there, and the aforementioned pulley wheel. I'll bring you back when it's all in position, and hopefully that's not later, more than a few minutes from now. Okay, the moment of truth. Timing belt is on. That's pretty close. And that's right on. I don't think we can be any closer than that. Thank you, Lord, for that help. And down here, the arrow is still pointing. So, good news. Now that that's done, we can loosen the bolt on the tensioner down there. There it is down there. The spring will pull the appropriate amount of tension on the belt. Once that happens, once I loosen that bolt, allow that, I'm going to rotate the engine a couple more times. I've already done that a couple times already through 2 revolutions each. So each revolution of the pulley down there is a half a revolution of the camshaft. So I have turned the pulley 4 revolutions. Camshafts have thus gone 2 revolutions. That pulls in all of the slack on this tension side of the belt. The tensioner, ironically enough, is on the non-tension side of the belt, being the fact that looking at the front of the engine, the pulley turns clockwise. So anyway, I'm going to loosen that bolt, allow the tensioner to spring to do its thing, rotate the engine, and then continue to put things back together after I retighten the tensioner bolt in its new sprung position. Motor mount is back on with those two bolts. Also reinstalled the rubber gasket, grommet, whatever, that seals off against this plate. And then that bolt there attaches this part of the motor mount bracket to that part of the motor mount bracket. And by the way, that had to come off because it was not going to allow me to get that timing belt into that spot. So it's off. So I've got the lower and the middle timing covers on, or timing belt covers. The screws are not tight. I've got the upper one sitting here with the final screws. I'll put those in, and then I'll move on to the valve cover, engine cover, whatever they want to call that. And I've got a new gasket for that that was along with the timing belt water pump kit. The old gasket's still there, and it's because the gasket that came in the kit doesn't fit. It's kind of different around these holes. I'm going to assume that it's kind of a universal timing belt water pump kit, in that fortunately parts that were supposed to match up for me, the timing belt and the water pump, do. This is the only part that I saw that did not go. And I tossed the thing and it's just disappeared. I was going to show you where it didn't match up, but I'm sure it'll turn up, and I'll bring it up then. Anyway, that's why you save parts. You don't throw anything away. This is going back on with this, and I guess I'll just buy another gasket. So, I don't know if you can see down there. Yeah, you can. There are spark plugs back in there. Per the manual, there was a need to install the spark plugs prior to tightening the crank pulley bolt, and I'm sure that's just to increase compression and help seat that more easily. So as you see, the valve cover's on, the timing belt covers, all three of them are on. Still necessary to put on after the pulley bolt down there is the pulley wheel on the water pump, then the belts, and then I can reinstall the engine mount, tying the engine back to this side of the car, and go from there. So let's see how the rest of that front comes together now. Oh, one of the things I did want to mention is that there is a bolt, yeah, you can actually see it right there, that holds one of the brackets. No, that's not it. It's down deeper. It's back in there, underneath this brace for the motor mount. Anyway, it holds a bracket that holds the alternator, and I had to remove it because it is a threaded hole on the water pump housing. So that has now been reinstalled, but not tightly. So I can adjust it when I get the belts in place, and then crank it down once the belts are on. That pulley wheel is back on. Now I've got the pin, which is in line with, yeah, that pin right there is in line with the keyway that was in line with top dead center on the crankshaft. So what I've also done is I've used some white paint to touch up the marks on the pulley wheel. I think you can see, if I kind of angle this over, that plate, or it's actually like a plastic tab on the timing belt cover, it's got a T on it. You can see that there is a little scribe just in this view underneath where that is, and that signifies top dead center. So when I go to time this, which I'll have to redo because of the change in the valve timing, I will use that mark and attempt to align it with the next larger mark to the left, which is 10 degrees before top dead center. And I'll go over all that when it's time, but suffice it to say I have a mark that I'll be shooting for with the timing light. So now it's on to the belt. I've got that belt on, and tight so that there's a deflection on the longest length of about 1/4 of an inch. The belt that I was told on a forum to get, I can't seem to get the power steering pump to rotate enough. Bring these two pulley wheels close enough together to get that belt to go over.